Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses the potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rodgers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're talking with Tracie Young-Brungard. Tracie is a Director of Recruitment and Retention within the Office of the State Fire Commissioners of Pennsylvania. Tracie is here to discuss the importance of incident documentation for fire and EMS. Tracie, I want to thank you for joining me again, and it's a pleasure to have you back on the program.
Glad to be back for another session.
Good to hear. So let's start the questioning with, why is documentation of the incident and our exposure so important in emergency services?
Well, our world revolves around documentation, from patient care aspects, fire investigation, research data, on and on, training documents, incident reporting, hazmat, and be able to comply with policies and standards such as like the bloodborne pathogens put out by OSHA, exposure and the potential for exposure from the activities that incidents, responses, and we're also dealing with injuries, and we have to look at the workman's comp aspect of it. So why do we document? As the saying goes in our business, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So we need to make sure that documentation is being done to minimize the impact on the health and the cost of our responders. But from a risk management perspective, documentation helps organizations to identify risk and implement change, provide education or re-education to minimize risk in the future. So looking at the task and the ways that tasks are performed, how often are these types of tasks formed? So looking at that high risk to low risk perspective and how many times these tasks are done.
So in this documentation process, what types of things and events should we be documenting?
The types of information that get documented would be based on the type of incident in accordance with local policies and procedures. But for an instance, you have an injury or a medical event at a live fire incident, a hazardous material incident, exposures to medical injuries, or even like the public health emergency. We want to make sure that we've captured what the type of exposure was. Was it chemical heat? Was it needle stick? What type of, injury was it? What type of illness occurred? What caused it? How long were they exposed? And, was the issue addressed and treatment rendered? Did they need ongoing care? Who was notified? So what's the process for notification within an organization? The company officers, what time, by what means? Is it a phone call? So basically, if it's, I look at the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why questions are a good start.
So Bryan Duquin is joining us on the program, and I believe he has a question. So Bryan?
So Tracie, you bring up a really good point there, and we see a lot of states, Pennsylvania being one of them, with the cancer presumption laws. So from a documentation standpoint, diving more into the exposure, what was actively on fire, just making sure that we capture all that stuff so that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, we get a diagnosis of cancer. We have ample documentation. So, the document shouldn't really be reading, we came, we saw, we conquered. It has to be a little bit more in depth. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree. And specifically just here in Pennsylvania, I can talk to, we have a couple avenues for documentation, at least from the fire perspective. We have PEERS, which captures under the 911 regulations, any severe injuries or line of a death that may occur from a firefighter. We also have the PENFERS or the NIMFERS reporting, which fire departments are required to report in their incidents. And in that system, they should also be including if there's an injury that has occurred or an exposure has occurred. Again, based on what their organization reporting process is, and due to be protective of personal information, we want to make considerations about the language that appears in those reports, and maybe it's just a reference to an incident number or report document number where they can go and get the detailed information.
So is this an internal documenting process, or is there a resource that's available that would help departments document this information that you just went over?
So within the Office of the State Fire Commissioner here in Pennsylvania, we do have a staff member who this is just their specific job is to deal with the PENFERS and the documentation reporting of incidents and looking for those. The PEERS also is in legislation, again, specifically for Pennsylvania. Those resources are out on the website, Office of State Fire Commission, or the PEMA website for the peers reporting. But in addition to that, those states that are OSHA and even those states that aren't OSHA, they do have exposure compliance processes, procedures, and regulatory stuff on there that forms can be used to build reporting and documentation. In addition to that, anybody, their insurance carriers might have some information or documentation forms and education that they can use. So
it's best for people that might be listening out of the state of Pennsylvania to check with the different agencies in their state that might have some similar, might not be the exact same thing as Pennsylvania, but some similar avenues to help them out in that area.
Yeah, I would encourage them to check at their state level, obviously with their insurance carrier, maybe the municipalities that they function within, and go from there. Maybe EMS could be another route for them to look at as well.
So typically, whenever we're documenting things, we have a document retention policy. So how does that factor into this? How long should we retain these incident documents?
So I think that's going to depend on, again, the type of injury, the medical condition, the exposure length. And Bryan alluded to the cancer presumption. So that's one thing that, we're working on to make sure that people are educated about those factors. Some good references to use other than local or state regulations or laws is the NFPA 1500 standard, which has a series in there, which addresses the fire department occupational safety, health, and wellness programs and the comprehensive occupational medical programs for fire departments. And again, OSHA does have some guidance there with the 300 logs, and it does vary about holding how long we retain those incident reports. So many resources out there they can use, but they really have to determine based on, their organization, if they're functioning under municipality and their insurance carriers. We also encourage them to make sure that they're checking with their legal counsel or their solicitor to make sure that the information that they have is accurate.
That sounds like a much easier question to ask than to answer.
Yes.
So in this documentation process, you mentioned, some medical aspects of it. Who has the ability to view these documents once completed? Because there could be a medical record component or HIPAA violation that could happen. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I think anything dealing with access to personal identifiable information should be considered when they're developing and implementing policies and processes, procedures. We also have the right to know request. We want to make sure that we're protecting and taking care of our personnel. That's key, and we want to ensure that information is held in confidence. As previously stated, the policy and procedures should be developed using information from local, state, federal laws and regulations, insurance requirements, HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is that personal identifiable information, and the state right to know law. In addition, organizations, again, should consider their legal counsel or their local solicitor.
Bryan, you have a follow-up?
So I think, that kind of brings into a good point is a lot of places are using some type of an electronic reporting system. So to your point, yes, we should be scrubbing those things out, but a lot of those systems have the data analytics side of the house. And I think that's something that organizations should really get more comfortable with, is learning that data analytics side to be able to pull some of that scrubbed out stuff that's really important, that helps drive, as you said, the training, the policies, the things that we're looking for with concrete information that's not identifiable to a person.
And I agree. I think it's really critical that fire organizations understand the importance of the reporting, the documentation of different events and incidents, exposures, and what do they do with that data? How's that data secured?
Well, Tracie, I want to thank you for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program, and you always bring a lot of great information. So I want to thank you again for joining us.
Thanks again. And I just, want to say one more thing. Encouraging fire organizations to have some type of wellness program, somebody in charge, taking charge of their own health and those that are around them, whether it's physical health screening, counseling, physical and mental health, fitness. Individuals need to be mindful and make sure that appropriate documentation is being done. So just an example, if you're injured, you need to make sure that documentation is being done. And, should anything occur later with a health condition, at least they have the documentation that is easily referenced.
Well, I think that's a good way to summarize and wrap up the program. So, Tracie, again, thank you for being here, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guest, Tracie Young-Brungard, once again for her time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.